And he offers us the opportunity now to take a look at the evolution of the language capacity from kind of really inside, from the perspective of someone who understands speech physiology and speech acoustics in ways that very few do. Eugene did his PhD at University of Wisconsin studying with Ray Kent, who was with us very recently to review the IIS program in our site visit. Ray is also, I would say, one of the sort of giants of this field of speech science. So I will turn it over to Eugene Buder.
Well, I was a little concerned about going last. Not that there's supposed to be any kind of wrap up or anchor, but it did give me some time to think about what themes would be most relevant to the seminar and possibly helpful at this stage. In some ways, I kind of wished I'd gone first because I do feel like the structures that are involved to convey the speech signal are useful to some degree, at least. I mean, it's my angle, but in thinking about the evolution of speech and language. Of course, the title of there are a couple of readings, and I understand the public members of the audience didn't do the readings. But we'll find out that they recognize that speech is different from language. Nonetheless, I think that looking at the mechanisms is going to help us understand what's physically possible and constrained in our bodies to convey language, especially through the acoustic medium. And we might think about why the acoustic medium. I have a lot to cover. I'm not sure. I'm probably going to have to cut short some sections. And part of the challenge also is that there's going to have to be some sort of tutorial orientation to some of the complexities of speech production, both in acoustics and physiology, in order to convey the message. I'll do the best I can in a short amount of time. And I do hope that towards the end, we will maybe have some wrap-up discussion and step back to the big picture, because it's our last time to do so in a public group. So the title on structures, there will be two to emphasize, basically. And one is probably the preeminent, most widely discussed speech adaptation for the last 20 or 30 years, having to do with something we loosely describe as the descended larynx. And so we'll talk about the position of our voice box, if you will, in the neck, and what significance that was thought to have in our language ability. But we're also going to turn to a subject that I think is pretty rich and very interesting to me, and less widespread in attention, but I think growing in importance, and that's the role of the respiratory system in supporting our speech capacity. And both of these, I think, will have surprising connections to our ability to encode sound and rapid sequencing that conveys language. There are many other mechanisms in neurological, I think, that need great amount of attention. I'm less qualified. I'll mention a few. And then I have just a handful of speculative ideas of my own to consider. Well, the neural connection and also the structure of the vocal folds. I just have a couple of slides, and maybe I'll leave them out if we don't have time. But I also want to give you an impression, an overview of how I decided to organize my speech science curriculum. 20 years ago, when being asked to convey teach how we convey speech, the classic kind of rather popular level exposition is called the speech chain. Came out in the 60s. And it emphasizes something that I love about our field is the fact that we have to consider physical nature of sound. We have to consider the physiological nature of sound producing mechanisms. We have to consider audition and neurology. And this is what's really fun about being in communication sciences and disorders, is that we look at the whole system. It's a very holistic science. And when I looked at what I had to teach and thought about what has to be known in order to understand the next step in the story, I realized that there probably is almost certainly an evolutionary story that defines this agenda, meaning simply that first there are vibrations of pressure that occur in media like air and water. But so I'm saying first there was sound. And if you ask, is there a tree fall in the forest, does make a sound if nobody's there to hear it? The answer is yes, there is still sound. because as long as there are vibrations propagating through the medium, we can just simply define that as sound. And we don't do anything to change that just by being people and organisms on the planet. The vibrations in the medium is pure physics. So that is a constraint. That's a physical basis that we have to wrap our heads around, literally. And I want to grant as well that the organism's first job in surviving in an environment is sensing those vibrations, just to understand, you know, what's coming at you. Just as we need to see things, we need to hear. And so I'm quite confident in saying that audition is evolutionarily prior. And when you do comparative study of organisms, I think senses of sensation of sound is way, way, way more ancient than organized production of sound. So I teach in that order. I teach physical acoustics. I step through the ear. I skip the brain because we have an entirely different course on that, and it's kind of complicated. I don't know what to do with that exactly. But you know, it comes out. But this is going to be vital, I think, and I do endorse the notion that our ability to imitate sound is key in language learning. I'm not covering that today, but the production of sound then is the last step, and specifically, even animals use respiratory and glottal systems to phonate, roar, and meow, and bark, and such. But that that's why only the face is on this picture, which is a shame because we're going to cover breathing and glottal mechanisms primarily today, but then it's the upper vocal tract that we articulate and becomes what is essentially uniquely human in this production of rapid phoneme sequences that produce language. So that's how the chain closes, but it's also literally how I decided to organize my teaching of this topic, an evolutionary scheme. So I thought I might have just mentioned that. And I think it's actually important when you decide what has to accommodate what in terms of the way these structures assemble. So the title of the book is Speech is Not Special. It's basically the title of the chapter from the book that I assigned, The Evolution of Language, says, what does it say? I forget. Speech is not special, but it's still important. I forget the title.
Something like that.
Something to that effect. Okay, fine. Anyway, it's in here. So what the pitch is claiming is certainly that complex articulated vocalizations are not language. And it's widely can be seen that we convey language. We could have done it visually. We do it visually in graphemes. We could communicate by sign language and gestures. And that speech just happens to be the default. It turns out it should have some evolutionary advantages in the sense that it does not require you to be seeing the people. You can do it in a dark cave, you can do it around the corner, you can shout over distance. And so I think there's clearly some advantage to that. And you can be doing other things while you're talking. You can be working with your hands and you can be facing away from each other. You can stay busy. So I think there are a lot of basic natural selection reasons why speech is primary means by which we do convey language. And you know, a lot of psychology, decoding and processing likes to study the visual system because we can manipulate it and it's static, and audition is a little more difficult. But what is overlooked about audition is that it has a much finer time resolution. That, you know, we can fool the eye by 10 times a second and you think it's a continuous motion. That's how cinema works. Ear can discern much more fine hundreds or even thousands of seconds differences in temporal structures. So the idea that audition is just faster, I think, is another reason why the auditory modality is how we convey speech. And we definitely can see that there are a lot of structures that are readily available for manipulating sound that are much more agile and flexible in their repertoire than the structures we might have to manipulate visual images. So we are looking for pre-adaptations, and the word that's best more, I'm not here to teach you evolutionary theory because I'm not an evolutionary theorist, but the basic idea is that structures evolve for a reason and then they're quickly adopted for an entirely new function. This seems to be the name of the game in a lot of speech and language evolution, as we learned this in the seminar. So it is the default signaling mechanism for all of these reasons, And it is pretty clear that the structure of speech production has heavily influenced the structure of our language system. So speech is not language. Now, the final thing about speech is the fact that it is physical and that we can look at structures, but when looking at evolutionary thinking structures, we have to primarily start with a fossil record. At least that's what's been traditional. And this is where a concern comes up. That's sort of to like set the stage for part of the drama of this story, is that what do you do with bones and how far can you take that? Unfortunately, both my stories are sort of start with bones, and we're trying to illustrate some of the risks of that, I think. It's a cautionary tale. So now I have some tutorial, which might be difficult because I have to do it very quickly. But the basic in speech that you need to understand in order to understand part of this talk is that we basically have two things. And from an acoustics engineering point of view, we have a source of sound and we have a filter mechanism which can manipulate the quality of that sound. Source filter model. It's called theory, but it's better than theory. It just works. It's a description. I call it a model. That when we decompose speech sounds into how they were made, we apply the idea that something has to create a pressure disturbance, which is what sound is, and then there has to be the capability to take that basic sound that's created and manipulate it, and we do that through resonance of the tubes that make up the vocal tract. So the primary source filter concept is for vowels on this side of this column here. So the source for vowel sounds, and actually a number of sonorant consonants as well, R's and L's, nasals and glides, is the vocal folds, okay? And that's a very important part of the speaking ability, is that we pass air through to vibrate. They vibrate with a nice clean periodicity very rapidly. They produce a tonal sound. But that's just the beginning. That's, again, something that creates a sound, and the sound radiates away, but it doesn't just go off in the atmosphere. It first passes through the set of tubes. So when you take a tonal sound like a tuning fork and just let it radiate, you probably can't hear that. Can you hear? No. Nah, you were lying. But okay, can everybody hear that? Yeah. That's a simple resonance, okay? And there's nothing that's actually amplifying the sound. It's a misnomer to call it a filter because it's kind of the opposite. It's something that passes something through with an enhancement. The sound is reinforced by what's called standing waves that form in this tube. So the sound source at the glottis, I'm probably not going to do that spectrogram demo. I don't think we have time. But I can demonstrate this in more detail. I can take my course. But the sound that is produced by the glottis has a simple spectrum. Well, it's complex in the sense that there are many harmonics. The shape of the sound is not a pure sine wave, but the spectrum has a range of frequencies that are all in the sound. Any complex sound can be decomposed. Any complex signal by Fourier's theorem can be decomposed into the spectrum of sine waves. Every sound, noises included, can be made up of simple sine waves. Like the same way we analyze white light by passing it through a prism to break out the wavelengths, we pass sound through the Fourier analysis and we see the harmonic sine waves. It's a tonal sound, so it has harmonic. But then this is the filter, and a tube like this actually resonates multiple frequencies. By the way, so, you know, that's a frequency that does not resonate. Another frequency will. Some don't, some do. So these are the frequencies that resonate, and that's the filter response of the vocal tract. This is what happens as it passes across your lips. And this is the resulting sound, which would basically be a simple schwa sound. Now the key is that we can manipulate the shape of the tube. This is just a pure cylinder. This is how it starts out, just with these even resonances. But as soon as you alter the cross-section of this tube somewhere, like create different resonant frequencies. These are called formants. the E had that formant suddenly it goes to a lower frequency, this goes to a higher frequency, you hear a different quality to the sound. I just phonate continuously, and I manipulate the shape of the vocal tract to change the filter, and that's how we create different vowels. The same idea works for consonants as well. You can create a turbulence noise, and you can have a short filter, same turbulence noise, longer filter, two different phonemes. Source filter is how we comprehensively describe speech. And once again, I want to emphasize that what's happening in this tube is happening in your vocal tract, and there all of these standing waves are forming, and wherever you squeeze or constrict the shape alter standing waves. That's essential to understanding much of what we're talking about. Now, there's a quick aside that's going to sort of foreshadow something that our primary author, Fitch, worried about. And it's the idea that you also know a lot of indexical things about a speaker when you hear them. And it's the size of these structures, the physical nature of how they are put together with respect to the wavelengths of sound. It's still physics that if the vocal folds are larger in men than they are in women, the pitch will be higher in women and lower in men. But it's a kind of odd observation, just as an aside, that if you hear a voice with a lower pitch, you'll assume it's a larger person. That's not true. I'm talking about the pitch of the voice. And you might hear somebody with a kind of a high-pitched voice, and turns out they're a very large person. That's within the sex. You know, obviously, the size of the vocal folds are very sexually dimorphic. It's one of the most dimorphic features, certainly of speech, that we have. The male larynx descends into the pharynx and increases its mass at puberty. That's when these fundamental frequency curves diverge. Do you recognize these two people? I'll tell you later. Jeff Tomlinson and Jenny White. Okay. Anyway, so here is again the basic idea in a chimp that they also have a larynx and a throat or pharynx, oral cavity, nasal cavity, and here are some pictures of those structures. Okay, speech is not language, but is important nonetheless. That's sort of the title I was wanting to evoke here. So that's the theme here. But what? Okay, Fitch is an author that I'm drawing from, who studied under Philip Lieberman, who articulated a very profound and widely received view that the larynx uniquely is found in humans to have descended down into the throat, creating a very different morphology for that vocal tract than any other species, chimps or orangutans, other great apes. The larynx is relatively high up. There are many differences, but the descent of the larynx to accommodate the ability of the upper vocal tract to be shaped, to create. I really love this idea, and people still love it. It's a very compelling story, and it's not entirely untrue, I don't think. But we're gonna debrief a lot. That's the main theme today, about what might be wrong with this story. But it was so compelling because, again, these physical waves have a certain dimension, and the idea that you have to like elongate the throat to just the right amount so that those waves fit in your vocal tract, and then you can manipulate them. You literally wrap your heads around the wave in order to control the wave. And maybe not, but we'll get there. So what was super compelling about the evolutionary story here is this idea that you have a larynx placed high in the oral cavity for a very good reason. You're gonna have to trust me on some of the visuals here because you need a kind of a 3D reconstruction with motion to totally grasp this. But I want you to observe the cartilage, which is part of this larynx, that you may have heard kind of acts like a trap door to cover the top of that airway. But in this case, what's most vital about it is that it interlocks with the velum, a tissue that can also act like a flap to close off the nasal cavities, but typically hangs down. When the epiglottis and the velum are interlocked in this regard, this is the three fluids and liquids can work around that structure, not passing into the tracheal airway, but going instead where they belong, the esophagus. So as soon as you push these apart, and this happens, this is the arrangement, by the way, you'll see, I think it's in the next slide, that you also have in the first 6 months of life as a human infant. So the human infant can be suckling at the breast, ingesting milk, the esophagus, and simultaneously breathing through the nose. I've never experienced this, from the adult point of view, but the idea is that the infant is just sucking away and doesn't have to stop and take a breath because they can be breathing at the same time. That's great, but in around 6 months and in adulthood, those organisms are no longer interlocked. All foods and liquids that are passing down here are vulnerable. They're passing across a kind of an open trap door, just loosely covered now, that would allow the solids and liquids to enter the airways, so you're at risk of choking. So Lieberman was seeing this comparative anatomy and saying, gosh, there has to be a big reason why you would suddenly put the species at risk for dying from every time they swallow, and probably it's speech. So Fitch points out, Fitch, did I mention, was Lieberman's star PhD pupil, and he became skeptical and decided to pursue this idea a little further. And one thing he points out is that about 3,000 people a year, which is not actually a lot. That's just a little fact. I'm going to play a video that I didn't show the group before because it's really, it's kind of rare. Early speech scientists subjected themselves to massive amounts of X-rays so that they could do cine radiography. And there's some really odd sentences spoken at the end of this, but I want you to watch the manipulation of the tongue. I'm going to talk a little over him because he's not making sense. I don't know if I am, but just watch. This is Ken Stevens, actually, and this was Joe Perkel's dissertation data from MIT. There's the hyoid bone. Here's the epiglottis. There's the velum, opening, closing. Primarily, I want you to focus on the movements of the tongue and the intense amount of articulatory control that's required in order for this person to be speaking.
A tet, a tot, a tech, a pen, he, dee, he, da, he, gee, he, ga.
Imagine all these resonant frequencies going up and through.
Why did Ken set the soggy net on top of his deck? I have put blood on her 2 clean yellow shoes. Stop.
I want to know about those, the blood, but I think it's just phonetically balanced. The sentence isn't used so much anymore. But so the notion here, I want to show you, let me, pause right there and point out, you really can't see it if it's not dynamic anymore, but the idea is that the tongue now is free in a kind of a globular form to manipulate the shape of this whole pharyngeal and oral cavity, primarily the oral cavity. You have a 2-tube system in which these resonant waves can form, and the tongue is now agile in a way to shape it. And the idea that it's mechanically separated from the attachments with hyoid and laryngeal structures, and that it can now be retracted into this space, giving it the room to move where it's the greatest in the oral cavity, is the basic idea here. And so the idea is that other animals can't do that because their larynges don't descend and they aren't structurally like this. Okay, so how many of you here, I asked the previous group, know about the phrase Old Long Johnson? You're a cat video guy. No? Okay, so that's a cue.
Oh, wait a minute.
Yeah, you know this one.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you skip the ad in 2, 1, 0, skip ad?
Oh, I don't. No, no. Oh, no, no. Oh, no, no.
You've never seen this?
Never seen it.
My gosh. Well, I have cats too, and they make, so that was articulation. Those were vowels. There were some consonants in
Most
there.
remarkable thing.
Yeah, now these like, the video is called Old Long Johnson. I mean, and now you know why. You gotta get that one up. So it's a little bit of a misnomer to consider that this arrangement is not mechanically possible. Oh, right. So now we got more ads, I guess. Oh, more fun with animals. Okay, you know how YouTube chains on. Okay, sorry. However, this articulation ability is something that we're doing with a great degree of control, and the control and the structure with which we do this is not something I can follow, but this is the essential idea that with lingual articulation, sufficiently rapid, and jaw movements, everything nicely coordinated, you have the capacity to form syllables. The syllables can have rapid form and transitions. You encode perceptually. You can appreciate these sounds at multiple temporal levels at once. You can hear the rhythmic structure of the syllables. You can hear the margins of those syllables, consonant, vowel, vowel to consonant movements. And that is what speech is. And the fact that we're doing that very rapidly is really key to our speech articulation ability. And, you know, the cat was doing it, but not really under full control with diversity. That's his entire repertoire. Old Long Johnson. I don't know what else.
That's pretty impressive.
Okay. So in fact, this is something that, that I study with Kim a great deal, that he's known is the fact that infants pass a significant transition when they are able to, oh, come on. No, I think oops. Nope. I'm getting used to my new PowerPoint installation. Hello? So this is a initial canonical babble, one of the first sounds that that children make suddenly that parents, oh, my little girl can talk. And examples are like ba, ba, da, da, ga, ga. So the canonical syllable that organizes between 5 and 9 months is a landmark event and which seems to be suddenly recognized as the first kind of elemental speech. Whether or not they intended to represent anything, they probably don't at that age, but they suddenly have this recognition, it's reproducible, it involves that syllable structure. Now, what I'm trying to convey to you right now is all the reasons why Lieberman felt that this descended larynx, the articulable tongue, the retracted root, and the ability of that tongue to reliably go to specific parts of the oral cavity is super important. There's a side argument I'll just mention quickly because it hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but we have to have corner vowels. We have to fill out the acoustic space for you to really understand. I'm going here, I'm going there, and hear those targets as phonemes. So one problem with that is the fact that everybody here has different vocal tract lengths, especially men, women, and children. So we're not actually hearing the same sound. We're hearing way different frequency ranges for all these different sized speakers. But we still need to see where they are in their vocal tract and reliably normalize for that. And one idea is that only if you go all the way to E, you're kind of hitting a corner, and you can go to ah. And once you hear people going to the corners of their vowel space, your mind can sort of map your perceptual expectations to that frequency range. So that's a fundamental problem in speech that is still being considered. But the basic idea is that you have to have an agile tongue that can reliably go to the corners, to high front E. It literally means you place a constriction high up in the oral cavity and more towards the front of the oral cavity, and you make that sound versus a low back ah, jaw, retracted tongue. So again, it's this ability to map across the space. So a basic and important breakthrough article that Lieberman published was to compare infant, chimp, and adult human, infant human, primate, non-human primate, adult human, and note that there are a number of features with respect to the angles of the structures, the position of the larynx. Again, within the newborn and chimp, they're high up and compressed up against the oral cavity. In the adult, it's descended down, as we've discovered. So there are a whole lot of structural comparisons that can be made based on the bone record. Yeah.
Chimp or Neanderthal?
I'm sorry, did I read? Yeah, thank you for reading my caption. So that's actually where I was going, is that this is the fossil record. Thank you, Andrew. That has distinctively like the infant in having a non-descended larynx. So immediately says, well, they must not have spoken. It can only be because of this descended larynx that we can get our tongue articulations to go into all those corners with the agility and systematic range that is required for speech. Strong hypothesis, clear physical evidence with fossil record. But, okay, actually, I'm not going to follow this link. There's the hyoid bone. Let me just briefly describe to you the fact that something cool about fossil records is the fact that we first think we can only look at the structure. You look at the structure of the hyoid bone in the Neanderthal, and it looks like it's placed in a part of the vocal tract that is not optimal for speech production. And so it was thought that it wasn't used. I think what's cool and still we need to pay attention to the structural record, because the article that just got published suggests that if you look at the histology of the bone itself, the same bone was reanalyzed, and stresses on the bone that can help indicate the functional linkages that that bone was under are consistent with the dynamic use of the hyoid bone as a sling. The hyoid bone is attached to all the oral musculature, and bones change depending on how they're used. And the usage of the patterns of usage on that bone were consistent with articulation. So even this story continues to evolve. Though at the point of static structure, it looked clear that it was not used for speech. Now, Fitch comes in and says, wait a minute, let's look at how the larynx is actually positioned, first of all, dynamically in actual articulations in other species, chimp, and in non-human species, non-primate species, but also even where it sits in current comparative anatomy. The idea is that we can think about evolution of speech and language by doing comparative analysis and good thinking about what's here now and what other animals are doing. And people weren't looking at these other animals and saying, well, what about the descended larynx? Well, it turns out that probably like that cat, dogs too, when they howl, lower the larynx. Arr! It drops down. So just because the larynx is positioned high in the throat, interlocking with the epiglottis in a static configuration, doesn't mean that it can't be lowered. And, well, my cat doesn't say those words, but they say meow. I mean, there's all the vowels in there, meow. And dogs are, ow. You can hear you hear resonating vocal tracts. So the idea that they can't mechanically manipulate the resonance of the vocal tract because the larynx is in the right position. And it's fairly obvious that it's false. I'm looking at a Neanderthal bone versus I'm just looking at speech production in species, period. So the speculation here is that the chimp, now chimps don't submit themselves to imaging and stay still, and so we don't really have the good data on this just yet. We're still looking at dead animals for the most part, but there's no reason that the chimp can't pull that larynx down either dynamically. So that's Fitch's drawing of the possibility. There were, in fact, a number of problems with reconstruction on skulls. So I'm going to broaden the argument right now. We're not going to deal with cranial capacity. Obviously, the brain increased in size at some point in hominid evolution, and that's key. But the other thing the other three things that are being looked at, we talked about the hyoid bone and reasons why we need to keep looking at it. But I didn't talk the basic cranial angle of the skull base thought to correlate very well with the position of the hyoid bone. Turns out not to be true. That's a lot of where Lieberman's analysis of the fossil record was getting its perspective. Another interesting finding that got a lot of splash in the literature and the press was the enlargent hypoglossal canal. So these are there are many foramina by which cranial nerves and of course your spine exit the skull. And among the largest in humans is the hypoglossal, which is the cranial nerve that's going to help primarily innervate the tongue, its motor capability. So they looked at a few species, fossil records, and said, oh, look how big hypoglossal canal is. And they also did comparative anatomy. Well, when they kept looking, and a primary author, K, kept looking and realized, uh-oh, the size that I've got in the fossil record is actually well within the standard deviation range of overlap between extant primate and human species. So I said, never mind. The idea that you can just look at the opening of the bone and infer how much structure there is, you have to look carefully. So I think we're ready to transition to the second part of the story. But before we do that, here's the other big finding that, again, looking at other species, are clear species that clearly have larynx lowered in the pharynx, in the throat. And there are even species that can dynamically lower their larynx so low, like all the way down to the bottom of the trachea, slippery structure descending down there, allowing them to do a famous roar and sound kind of big and scary. I don't know, it's being teased about that being a mating call. I think it's more like a threat. But at any rate, notice, okay, what we're looking at here, quick side story about how size matters, so to speak, is this idea that regardless how big your vocal folds are, you can manipulate pitch to a degree, but we cannot manipulate the length of our vocal tract. So when you hear the length of the resonating tube, you know how big that creature is. This creature fooled you, but we don't. So this is what we call in biocommunications an honest signal, primarily in humans. Pitch can be manipulated, it can sound like really low and important, but your vocal tract length is not very easy to manipulate. You know how big I am by hearing the resonances, the formants. We also can note that the larynx enlarges and significantly descends at puberty, we pointed out, in boys and not in girls. And actually, boys don't talk any better than girls at that age. They actually have a little trouble because of this structural issue. Their speech, they have not just phonatory, but articulatory issues when that larynx descends. So the larynx doesn't descend. The larynx descent in boys, not girls, gives them no damage. It does make me sound bigger. Nonetheless, let's not rule it out. The idea that it's down there it does afford some articulation advantage. It just can't be the story. And it's not the simple story that Lieberman was telling. Quickly, part of Fitch's story is that maybe there's something special about human speech perception. So as long as we're going to say what's special about the structures that uniquely endowed us with speech, you might want to look at the auditory system. The thing that's sometimes observed in the auditory system is that we are most sensitive to frequencies. And the frequencies to which we are most sensitive seem to be pretty important in the speech signal. I don't know if you remember my evolutionary view, but my evolutionary view is that these structures evolved for long before they evolved for speaking. And this same sensitivity is found in chimps who don't speak. This sensitivity is conferred primarily because the ear canal has a resonant frequency. Just the length of that ear canal creates a sensitivity at certain frequencies. It's a picture of the resonance of a tube that length. And that ear canal didn't get any bigger or smaller when we adapted to speech. This is not, if anything, this is kind of simple, but I think this is big picture story. Speech adapted to this sensitive region, not the other way around. The sensitivity of this region wasn't an adaptation that conferred speech on us, but we definitely had to speak in frequency bands that were nice and audible. So that's why I still feel like it's pretty obvious that hearing came first.
But did we fine-tune it a little bit?
Hmm?
Did we fine-tune it? Did it co-evolve a little bit?
You know, Oberon was looking into this a little bit. But here's another example of something that people are like, wow, the human brain is adapted to speech. Again, I'm going to have to do this fairly quickly, but there's something important that some of you will have heard about, especially in psychology, I hope, called categorical perception. So when I go ba and I go pa, the difference is that I delay the onset of voicing. I can go ba and pre-voice, ba, or I can go pa and delay the voicing quite a bit. Now, either synthetically or by practice, and I kind of think I can try to do this, ba, 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 pa, 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 you can manipulate that on a continuum, definitely synthetically. So you can create a continuous set of stimuli that differ by exactly the same amount. To demonstrate categorical perception, you do two things. First of all, you ask people to say, I hear a ba, I hear a ba, I hear a ba, I hear a ba, and then they start saying, I hear a pa, I hear a pa, I hear a pa, I hear a pa. They hear them in categories. But what's really critical is that you also ask them to identify how big a difference they hear between contiguous stimuli. This is the identification, and this is discrimination. When discrimination is only as good as identification, then you have categorical perception. Let me point out what I just said. Discrimination only occurs across pairs that are identified differently. The same acoustic difference within a set of stimuli, just as big a difference that are identified the same, no more discriminability. And there's all kinds of problems with this, it turns out. If you listen carefully, you can discriminate. But this is like, oh, the brain has adapted to these phonetic categories. We learn to ignore within category variation. We are tuned to category variation because we have experience with these categories as speech. But chinchillas do this too. And pigeons do it. So it's not about speech experience. In fact, as I was claiming before, this is easily explained as an onset asynchrony threshold. That when stimuli, this crossover boundary is about 20 milliseconds. It turns out that in all species, as soon as two sounds come in, more than milliseconds apart from one another, your auditory system identifies them as having unique sources. It's the auditory system's job to analyze the environment and understand fine time detail. It seems to have been adapted. It's useful for speech, but it's not about speech. It's the basic picture there. So, speech. Another contender is respiratory control. This is an attended. This is what am I trying to say? Underappreciated topic, and one of my favorite is respiratory control in speech. So I also gave the group a secondary optional reading by McLaren and Hewitt, and they, again, it starts with a bone record, but it has an entirely different story around it. They looked at a famous Nereocotombo boy, Homo ergaster, of antiquity about 1.6 million years ago. And there's a really well-developed skeleton for this hominid that identifies something that actually known when you look at the spinal column and the girth cord through the vertebrae. The girth of the cord, the diameter of the cord is narrower in the thoracic region in general. The reason is wider in cervical and lumbar regions is because those are where the limbs go. So wherever you have a spinal cord serving an extended limb with complex musculature, it's going to get bigger to supply both efferent and afferent nerves to that challenging set of structures that unilateral support. So we think about the girth, and this is just a coincidence. This slide is about just the fact that the thorax is narrow, but their observation was that it was significantly more narrow in this skeleton than it is in humans, in Homo sapiens. This is just some slides which I wanted to impress upon you, all the extensive musculature that innervates the rib cage and use during speech. I'm going to go quickly without giving you another. Those of you who took my speech science class would realize I'm doing about 2/3 of my class, and I don't know if people are hanging in there, but here's something. Try me, okay? And we might have an activity. Okay, so the thorax is built mechanically in a way that has a springiness, an automatic recoil force that we work with. It's already got forces built into it, and the primary forces are the elasticity of the lungs trying to collapse, but the torque of the ribs trying to expand. They balance each other. Whichever way you breathe, you're kind of working with or against those forces. I think you can do it seated down. I usually have people standing up for optimal effect. But if you just exhale and go to what we call resting expiratory level, if you just let go, you automatically go to a certain part in your range of breathing. You can breathe out, let go, and you'll bounce back. If you take a breath in, very high breath in, he wants to exhale again. These springs working you back to the resting expiratory level. By where the ribs are pulling out, the lungs are pulling in, everything's in balance. So every time you breathe in, you experience this positive pressure that wants to push the air out again. And that's how you normally breathe when you're sitting there. Is just, all you have to do is activate the diaphragm, expand the volume, feel that breathing in. That's a muscle. Then let go and breathe out. So inspiration is active, expiration is passive. If you aren't speaking, when you speak, you generate an extended utterance, and the primary requirement for you to convert this exhalatory flow into sound is that you're presenting a constant pressure and flow to the sound mechanisms. I take a breath in and I start talking, and I'm blowing air through the glottis and blowing air through constrictions in the vocal tracts and all those things, and it just keeps happening on one breath. And the whole time I'm doing that, I'm going down, down, and down, and all those springs are changing, but I'm controlling, I'm regulating them with muscles. Animals don't do that. And people with neurological deficits don't do that. We see clients, I'm not a clinician, but I've helped with instrumentation on a man with traumatic brain injury, and he tried to take breath in, and was like, and that's how you talk if your ability to cortically override the normal breath control strategy is not intact. So we're constantly tuning all of those chest wall muscles to regulate that pressure. We have to do it against, and if you try this at home, but you can kind of take in a deep breath and start phonating. You actually are holding it in. And as you keep phonating, you feel it going out a little farther, but then you keep phonating more and you can feel yourself pushing it out. You're constantly tuning the muscles to counteract these passive forces. It's an amazing cognitive strategy that, again, requires cortical control. We have additional, there's details I don't have time to add. So this is a picture of you breathing just normally, and this is a picture of you breathing while speaking. You take a quick inhalation and you exhale slowly while gating those flows and pressures to produce sounds. This is distinctive human speech breathing, and it allows extended utterances. During this extended utterances, you're constantly controlling the pressure and flow. It was established early on that every time you speak, you know exactly how long the sentence is. If it might not feel like it, but it turns out you have the right amount of air. You give somebody a text, say, read this, they take in just the right amount of air. We plan the volume of air that we need for every utterance we make. This is cortical control. Normally, breathing is a matter of the brainstem. It keeps you alive. You do it while you're sleeping. You do it while you're under anesthesia. But we do it with planning and cognition when we're speaking. This is the benefit, if you think about it, from how would you talk every time you talk like this? Every time you take a breath, you can't just let it off. I mean, I could feel better. And this is the way some people with disorders will speak, and it's difficult to follow what they're saying. If you try to keep that phoneme stream coming within a time frame that people can process and arrange those phonemes, and you have enough of them that you can start making clauses and syntax, this affords the ability to regulate expiratory airflow is really significant. Even while teaching and thinking about speech, students and myself, we don't think about the fact that speech is breathing and how important our regulation of breathing is to speech. So, by the way, this was kind of a breakthrough, and this is something that McLaren and Hewitt, I think they were maybe aware, but we actually regulate linguistic variables with our respiratory pressures. And it was generally assumed that, well, if I want to talk louder, I might use more pressure, okay? Which I'm doing when I lecture to a group. And maybe I'm talking at home or to my cat or something or whatever, I can use less pressure. But not too long ago, it was demonstrated that when Pop took his socks off, 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 that when you are using emphasis, which is usually a discourse thing, by the way, you know what somebody was thinking, so you know what you have to emphasize in order to correct what they were thinking. So it becomes extremely, it becomes discourse-oriented and cognitive in your ability to regulate lung pressure has significant advantages for discourse. And in fact, my colleague, this is one of my favorite studies, observes that in dialogue and conversation, and here I can't have a Buder talk without a couple oscillators, okay, that was it. That the actual oscillatory nature of breathing is something that we coordinate across participants in conversation. That when you're actually in a conversation and not a lecture, you can anticipate when it's your turn to talk, you time the utterances so that they are coordinated with your partner in conversation. Again, it's exquisite cognitive discourse and anticipatory of where you are in the conversation. Even when that conversation is spontaneous and unplanned, we're still regulating our respiratory patterns. So, McLaren and Hewitt showed that the correlation of the spinal column overall with body weight is found uniformly across all species. The correlation of the thoracic vertebrae girth correlates across species except for humans. And that vicinity of humans, and by not in Homo ergaster, based on the analysis of the vertebral canals in that skeleton, that boy lay on this line. Adult humans have uniquely larger thoracic canal, ostensibly to do everything that I've been just talking about, regulating respiratory behaviors in service language, discourse, conversation. And specifically, it is primarily the gray matter, which is this is kind of a technical point, but the thoracic canal is housing not just the nerve supply and cell bodies for the local innervate nerve supply, but it also has all the other nerve supplies for lower structures coursing past it. Those lower structures coursing past through that canal are white matter, axonal. The gray
Is here in black.
yeah, which is here in black, and the gray is the gray. No, the white is the gray, and the black is the white.
Yeah.
Night is day, whatever. So at any rate, it's these cell bodies in the thoracic region that are dominantly accounting for the girth of spinal nerve supply, uniquely in humans, in this vicinity of the vertebral canal where all those muscles of respiration are housed. So, I got just some freebies to throw at you. Something completely unexplored, an idea that I had, is the fact that uniquely in humans, the vocal fold tissues have this segregation of cell types that do two things. They're called lamina propria. They absorb collision. They allow us to keep talking all day. There's a massive amount of heat. The amount of kinetic energy your vocal fold to absorb is much, much greater than operating a jackhammer for even an hour. The physical trauma and the diseases and injuries occur because of voice use, but the physical trauma and literal heat that develops is extremely significant. These tissues have to be hydrated, they're gelatinous, they're collagenous, there are all kinds of ways in which these cell layers are adapted to vocalizing, and moreover, there are the deeper layers form what's called a ligament. A ligamental-like connective tissue that's not found in dogs or other species, which acts like a string and allows us to manipulate pitch in ways that other species cannot do. So the extension of the lamina propria, the development of these layers of tissue are key to speech production. It's completely unexamined whether or not this was of evolutionary significance, but what's really cool is that the tissues don't develop unless the human uses them. There's a study that examined a variety of ages of subjects that never used the vocal folds, and none of this tissue segregation occurred. I thought about this when I heard about, I think the name is Baldwin effect. This is epigenetic.
Yeah, not that.
Yeah, this is
Not a Baldwin effect. Okay, well, tell me the name of this, because you told me the story. Camels develop calluses on their pads as a result of walking. Camels,
this is an epigenetic effect.
it's an epigenetic effect. Okay, so scratch Baldwin, whatever. If the species, if there are mutations that make camel pads develop calluses more quickly, those camels will have an advantage. But they actually have to walk on them in order for those calluses to form. I'm quite sure the lamina propria are like that, but nobody's looked at this.
It's well demonstrated that lamina propria do not develop in chimpanzee or in other monkeys.
They are not found to this elaborate extent in any other species. Finally, we have uniquely cortical control of the glottis. We do not know what other hominids look like in this manner because brains did not evolve, or were not preserved to our, I think brains evolved. I didn't say that yet. Oh, I'm over time. Maybe my words are failing me, but I have an idea that human mother-infant interaction helps the human infant develop cortical control of the glottis that has evolved uniquely in humans. So there are neural and laryngeal structures I want you all to look at when you turn your minds to these questions. That's in my talk. Let's talk about the whole seminar in this light, if you want. Chief? Yes.
Curious about it. So like all my singers they have like really big chest and big like throat. Because I really hope them to project like the voice voice to be louder, or is it just slower?
Well, I mean, since you asked, there is something called the singer's formant, which I can give you articles about, that you can learn how to shape the epilarynx so that it acoustically is kind of shaped more like a megaphone. So I can go, ah, I can, ah, and it's just, you suddenly manipulate the resonant properties and it cuts through the orchestra. This is well known.
But is it easier if you have like that kind of body shape?
I think so. I mean, you know, there's a simple respiratory capacity that you're talking about, but the respiratory capacity of humans is not unique. That is not, again, we don't just have more air. We have air that we regulate more clearly. And Fitch is open, my, you know, fellow speech scientist, as am I, to the idea that a musical expressivity in early hominid evolution was as much potential for drive for respiratory control. The most elaborate respiratory control, the type that I talked about, is found in current singers. And it was one of Darwin's original ideas that singing and musicality, vocal musicality, was a proto-language. That's a controversial idea, but it's very consistent with both respiratory and glottal mechanisms that we see uniquely adapted in human speech.
I have many questions. But
Okay.
I'll pick one. So
That sounds
so there's a lot of different structural, you're talking about the structural differences we have, and then you got to the breathing, but there's a lot of temporal precision in our tongue and all of our face muscles and velum. So you've probably seen the MRI of people beatboxing, right?
yeah.
It's the temporal precision that they have to have to
Well, it's a
make-
little bit like that cine graph that I showed you too.
Yeah, exactly. So isn't it more just kind of a general temporal precision of a
Yes.
lot of our structures?
But, well, first of all, I don't exclude neural organization under the heading structure.
Yeah.
But secondly, it is very much in the spirit of the descended larynx argument to decouple the tongue from its attachments and position it in a way that its extant agility can then be released and it can get the temporal precision you want. And similarly with respiratory argument, the notion that you're specifically ribcage thoracic and not abdominal muscle precision is about those like emphasis points. You know, I'm exaggerating right now, but you can like do that by quick, very rapid, very well coordinated gestures of your thoracic skeleton. So they need innervation, but they also need enhanced, I mean, the muscles were always there. Those same muscles are found in other species. But the idea that could be controlled quickly and precisely within specific muscle groups, not just activated, but relaxed quickly as well. It's all part of the structure argument.
Okay, so maybe the structure came first and the temporal precision came
Where
after.
Fitch is going in his book is that, okay, so it's not the descended larynx, it's got to be something in the brain. I mean, there's no it,
Right.
but the story takes you to not the nature of audition, not even the nature of the vocal tract per se, but the way it's coordinated neurologically. I just don't know much about that. It's complicated.
So at one point you were talking about planning how much you needed to breathe in relative to. So I'm curious about the causality in that. So could the causality actually be reversed, which is I have so much breath capacity at this point, so that's going to constrain what I can actually decide to say.
Well, the experiment manipulated the length of the
It
material.
did that? Okay.
But I will grant you this. It's the same answer, but different question. We talk about the idea that the extended expiratory cycle, the duration of that cycle, is what's so awesome about speech breathing. But I'm sort of setting aside the fact that while you're speech breathing, you're closing and opening valves.
Mm-hmm.
So pneumatically, if you will, just by the fact that I took in a deep breath and then start opening and closing the valves in my vocal tract while I let it out, it's going to be extending it. What's cool though is that McFarland found that, and you kind of went with my last slide that I didn't show you now, or at least I'm going there. The biggest difference, we used to feel like what you want to measure in discriminating rest breathing from speech breathing is what we call the inspiratory to expiratory ratio. And instead of being nearly symmetrical, like 4 to 6 or whatever, it's more like 1 to 9. And it turns out that when you look at conversational speech, that ratio is statistically not as discriminative of conversation versus listening breathing as the time of inflation. The rapidity of our breath in is possibly most important. And it's again during that breath in that we are preparing ourselves to speak this much of a sentence. So I don't know how conscious you can be of it, but you might think about, I just took a really deep breath in because I have a very long sentence I'm about to say. The evidence is in favor of a planning mechanism. And it breaks down in diseases like Parkinson's disease, which have both. The chest wall stiffens as you age, and the musculature stiffens with that pathology, but their management, their cognitive management also shows deficits, and that's nice because we can work with that. We can teach them to take a deep breath in. We can teach them to plan to take breaths at syntactic boundaries. So again, the idea that cognitive and structural, if you will, factors have to remain in concert is really what speaking is about. Did I answer 3 or 4 questions, and was one of them yours?
Yeah, you did. I'm sitting here wondering. Something I never wondered before is how much you could use breathing in that way as a kind of correlate of someone's cognition. So
yes.
If they're actually breathing while they're reading, could you use it as like a measurement of how well they're reading?
We see it in child speech development,
yeah.
that they learn to plan their inhalations at the correct times while reading. And we see it degenerate in these older adult conditions.
That's very interesting.
Oh yeah. It's Megan White who's really pursuing this agenda.
Would you say just a little something about speech-like breathing in the human infant? Or, I mean, the PARM results,
He can't say a little bit.
Well, yeah, they did not. The reason I don't want to say it because they lacked conclusiveness. They did not show big differences during articulated speech versus unarticulated speech. The one thing that my 2 dissertations reasonably related to this topic showed is that the speech breathing patterns are very well established even before articulate speech develops.
So the rapid inhalation and then vocalization over a longer period of time.
Yeah, it's very well established in infancy, which, if I can run with that, would be consistent with the idea that it was an early phylogenetic adaptation. That our ability to control respiration was a precondition.
I like that.
Well, and you like it because one of the reasons, I run with this for a second and then Phil. I used to think that this is consistent with the aquatic hypothesis because extended retention of air in the lungs might be adaptive for diving, for example. The biggest problem with that is that, at least by the McLaurin and Hewitt results, that the aquatic phase, millions and millions of years, hundreds of millions of years prior to any of this thoracic business. The idea
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. That,
if you look at the different
but
water side
Hagen
hypothesis.
thinks it's right in the range that you're talking about.
Oh, really? Well, see, I'm kind of waiting. I don't even want to look because it's like I want to make some predictions and then see if that works. But that's cool. But here's where I changed my thinking. I think the biggest deal about water environment when it comes to glottal and respiratory control is the ability to anticipate a rapid inhalation and the ability to maintain closure of the glottis to prevent
Your head comes out of the water.
to plan for the time that your head comes out of the water and open the glottis at the same time that you activate an inhalation. What's really cool about that is that it suggests that the cortical glottal link, uniquely human, is all you need. You don't need this fine regulation and emphasis of pressures and extended utterance and syntax in order to survive in water. All you need is a quick inhalation and good coordinated management of glottis. So that's where the aquatics.
And you also have to plan how much air you're gonna take down, or whether
before you dive.
Yeah, you have to plan your dive and how long.
Right,
You have
but
to
you don't have to plan to manage the pressures and flows like you do for speech. So that could have come much, much later. And the planning for diving and quick inhalation was very, very early and very well established.
Sometimes you do have to do that because you need to blow out air in order to go
go
deep.
down.
And yeah, so Bill.
Well, yes, so I think you're talking about the breathing stuff in particular.
I like it.
Think about the yoga I had studied years ago.
Oh yeah.
And so you probably heard of pranayama.
No.
Pranayama is the entire science of breathing. And
Well.
when people are serious about yoga, it's considered to be as important, if not more important, than the actual physical posture as they do.
Yeah, well,
And so
I meditate, and it's much about
Yeah, and so in fact, I was thinking about some forms of meditation and actually active breathing methodologies where you're half closing your glottis
Mhm.
on the out breaths in order to focus the mind and maintaining that glottal concentration throughout the entire meditation. And so obviously these are sort of unscientific references. And
Okay.
I'm kind of wondering whether or not there's a connection to science there and whether anybody studied this 1,000-year-old schools.
I wish so. I mean,
perspective.
my experience with meditation is very much a part of the awareness of
Good idea.
respiratory control. Yeah, I love it.
It's a good
I mean,
idea.
you went aquatic. Now we're going with mindfulness. So
Yeah, no, it's a great idea.
what is really cool about monitoring your breathing during meditation is that you don't have to be very cortical about it.
Well, so that's what
That you can be aware of breathing
So
as
you're
a
talking
basic
about-
life.
You're
Yeah.
talking about a more Buddhist meditation.
Okay.
Yoga meditation totally interferes with the breathing and tries to control it. It's
Okay.
very different. So,
Yeah, but the idea again that managing respiration is something we've been doing ever since we had lungs. And when I say we, I mean just organisms on the planet. And that humans have now co-opted in a very, very particular way that suggests a really, really high to very low level functional connectivity in the brain.
So, but do you really think that we need more gray matter in the thoracic?
That's what they're saying.
That's what they're saying. So let's make this a little more concrete. We need more cell bodies and more.
More cell bodies
axons,
implies more axons projecting from exactly that level, is the way I understand it.
And they're
Yes.
going to be controlling intercostal muscles. And
Yeah,
what
all
else?
of those thoracic. They also control the abdomen, and something that's actually kind of cool, I have to run with this, is that they receive afferent from the margins of the diaphragm. The diaphragm is controlled by cervical or phrenic nerve bundle for inhalation, which is a good thing because you need to keep breathing. But if you want to sense the level of a breath, it turns out, I mean, I'm just drawing these connections as a speech scientist, which is the name of today's game, is that it is the margins of the diaphragm that elevate the rib cage, and afferenting those is going to tell you exactly what that rib cage elevation is. So once again, neurological circuitry that help you be aware of exactly how well your lungs are positioned for a given speech act is going to be advantageous. And those are all in this region where they're claiming they think that the humans have uniquely dense or populated gray matter.
That they had more, that they have now more than that.
Than their Gaster boy.
Tomei boy did.
Yeah,
But the problem is that they don't appear to be.
or other
bigger-
primates.
Bigger. Well, didn't they say that they don't appear to be bigger?
That's the
than
part that I
chimpanzees?
need. I wish I had them on
Exactly.
cell phone number, because they said, oh yeah, it's bigger, and it's not.
Yeah, exactly. The
I-
argument is
yeah.
not.
There was
That shows
I read that twice, and I maybe should have called them.
Yeah, we're gonna write them. Okay.
Okay, let's do it. But it's a good story.
Well, of course, it's an interesting
it's
story.
the
This
kind of
idea
stories
of
we tell.
respiration being really specially controlled in humans.
We don't
Extremely appealing.
think about that as much in speech, and we really need to.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Okay, Well, yeah. So more research is needed.
Definitely.
Yeah.
The Phil's question, I just looked it up real quickly, and it looks like there is specific research on that breathing technique, on things like asthma,
Alcohol.
heart rate alterations.
Well, there are all kinds of sports physiology and
Yeah.
as well as reasons to understand that your ability in this competitive apneic diving, your ability to manage your oxygenation through conscious control, respiratory system continues to evolve, it seems, with practices like this.
So it's a little bit on cognition. In there.
Yeah, so you think during yoga. You think during yoga.
You try not to.
Oh, well,
No, the breathing
But you
affects
do.
cognition.
no, but the Buddhist meditation is really like
Yeah.
not,
No mind, no mind.
Yeah, no mind versus one-pointed mind, that's the difference.
I see.
Well, it's 5:20.
Oh, yeah, on that note.
If anyone would like to ask Eugene any further questions.
Well,